Late night in Memphis, late 1960s. The courthouse is thick with smoke and tension, the air heavy with the hum of tired ceiling fans and the restless shuffle of spectators. Every bench is packed, the room buzzing with the expectation of another ordinary hearing. Near the back, almost hidden, sits Elvis Presley in a dark suit, collar pulled high, trying to disappear into the woodwork. To most, he is a ghost in the crowd, silent and unremarkable. He hadn't come for drama. He hadn't expected more than a few dull legal arguments. But then the iron door creaked open. A deputy led a man into the room, shackles clinking faintly, striped prison uniform hanging loose on his shoulders. The whispers started, but Elvis heard nothing. The moment froze. His stomach tightened, his pulse hammered. Because the man in chains wasn't just another defendant, it was Johnny Ray, the boy who once sat with him on a Tupelo porch, singing gospel into the humid night, barefoot and hungry, their voices carrying dreams bigger than the dirt roads beneath them. Elvis gripped the armrest of the bench, his knuckles white. The courtroom around him blurred, the smell of dust and sweat dissolving into memory. The question tore through him with brutal clarity. How had the boy who once sang like an angel ended up here branded as a criminal? The king of rock and roll had faced screaming arenas and crushing fame, but nothing prepared him for this. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summer heat in Tupelo during the 1940s was the kind that seemed to cling to the skin, thick as syrup and merciless. The streets were unpaved, nothing but packed dirt and loose gravel where dust rose in small clouds with every step. Wooden shacks lined the roads, their boards weathered and thin, paint long gone from most of them. Life here was simple but not easy. Every porch seemed to creak under the weight of exhaustion, and yet from some of those porches music leaked out of cheap radios. The voices of gospel choirs, the crackle of country fiddles, or the deep call of blues drifting from stations farther south. On the corner of Old Saltillo Road stood one of those humble houses, barely holding together. Inside lived a boy with blondish-brown hair, skinny knees, and a shy smile, a boy named Elvis. Across the tracks, in another house that looked more like a patched-up barn than a home, lived Johnny Ray. He was a year older, taller, with sharper features, and an unusual brightness in his eyes. The two boys found each other before they knew what friendship was. It started with something small, sharing a marble, a stick of gum, a secret hiding spot under the trees, and it grew into a bond no one else in town quite understood. They spent hours on the front porch, elbows propped on their knees, listening to the radio that Elvis's mother, Gladys, treated like a holy object. She saved coins to pay for the electricity that kept it alive, and sometimes she would hum along with the hymns. Johnny, barefoot and hungry more often than not, was welcomed on that porch as though he belonged there. Gladys would hand him a slice of bread with a smear of peanut butter, and Elvis would tear his sandwich in two if that was all they had. To Elvis, it was natural. To Johnny, it felt like salvation. Sundays were a different kind of magic. In the little Pentecostal church nearby, voices rose up like thunder. Wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of congregants swaying to the hymns, and the preacher shouted with sweat running down his neck. But the children's voices carried above the rest. Elvis sang with sweetness, high and clear, but Johnny's voice was something else entirely. It filled the room with a richness that seemed impossible for a child. Women turned their heads, men tapped their shoes, and more than one person whispered, "That boy is bound for something greater." The two boys would sometimes sneak away after service, racing down the dirt road barefoot until they reached the edge of town where traveling musicians sometimes gathered. There, hidden behind crates or peeking through cracks in wooden walls, they watched grown men bend their guitars, coaxing raw sound that made the air itself tremble. Johnny's eyes shone every time he heard it. He whispered to Elvis once, "One day we'll be up there, you and me." Elvis grinned shyly, believing it. But even then, shadows clung to Johnny. His father, a hard man with fists faster than words, spent most evenings with a bottle. When the shouting started, Johnny would slip out the back door and walk the dark roads until he reached Elvis's porch. Sometimes Elvis found him curled on the steps, shoulders trembling, but face set hard as stone. They never spoke much about it. Elvis just sat beside him, passing a sandwich or a sip from a mason jar of sweet tea. They were boys, too young to name cruelty, but old enough to feel its weight. The contrast was plain, even to outsiders. Both families were poor, scraping by on scraps of work and prayers. But where Elvis had the steady presence of his mother's love, Johnny had chaos at home. That difference left a mark. Elvis carried a softness in him, a gentleness that came from knowing he was cared for. Johnny carried restlessness, anger pressed beneath his skin like fire waiting for a spark. There was a summer evening when the two sat on a fence rail and watching the sunset burn orange and purple over the fields. Elvis hummed a hymn under his breath, and Johnny joined in, his voice strong and certain. After a while, Johnny fell silent and said, almost to himself, "You think they'll ever know our names?" Elvis, still gazing at the horizon, shrugged. "Maybe, if we keep singing." It was the kind of talk only children dared believe, but the truth was, everyone in the neighborhood already whispered about Johnny. His voice was stronger, fuller, even more promising than Elvis's. At the church, people would lean toward one another and say, "That boy's got the gift. He'll go far." They said it while nodding toward Johnny, not Elvis. And Elvis knew it. He never showed jealousy. Instead, he looked at his friend with admiration. To him, Johnny's brilliance wasn't a threat. It was a wonder. Yet behind Johnny's gift, the cracks grew. The bruises from home, the nights spent wandering, the hunger he tried to hide. More than once, Elvis slipped a biscuit into his pocket at supper just to hand it off later. Johnny never said thank you, but he ate it fast as if ashamed of needing it. Years later, Elvis would recall those nights. The sound of cicadas in the dark, the way Johnny's voice echoed when they sang together under the stars. The bond forged not just in music, but in shared poverty. But even then, he would remember something else. The unease he felt when Johnny's eyes turned hard, when laughter died in his throat, when the weight of his father's rage seemed to shape his very bones. For the people of Tupelo, the two boys were just children with dreams too big for their town. But for Elvis, Johnny was more than a friend. He was the mirror of everything Elvis could have been. The same poverty, the same hunger, the same thirst for music, only without the shield of a mother's love to soften the blows. And that difference would matter more than either of them could imagine. That summer closed like every other. Fields harvested, school starting, radios humming on porches. The boys kept singing, kept dreaming. But beneath the songs and laughter, a question hung in the air unspoken. Which of them would escape the dust of Tupelo, and which would be swallowed by it? The years between boyhood and manhood passed quickly, though not evenly for everyone. By the end of the 1950s, Elvis had already lived what seemed like several lives. He had been the shy Tupelo boy with patched clothes, the teenager who wandered into Sun's studio with trembling hands, the soldier in Germany polishing his boots. And now, by the time he returned from the army, he was no longer simply Elvis Presley. He was Elvis, an idol whose face was printed on posters, whose voice poured from radios across America, whose very presence sent crowds into a frenzy. Memphis itself mirrored this change. The city had grown louder, brighter, pulsing with jukeboxes and neon lights, its streets humming with people chasing fortune or forgetting despair. Beale Street buzzed with music spilling from bars, while downtown shop windows displayed records with Elvis's name in bold letters. Every corner held someone who claimed to know him, or to have brushed shoulders with him once. His image was everywhere except in the shadows, where men like Johnny Ray now lived. Johnny's life had bent in the opposite direction. While Elvis wore uniforms and stage suits, Johnny wore overalls and heavy boots. He worked shifts unloading crates in warehouses by the river, his back aching, his hands raw from rope and splinters. Nights found him not on stage but hunched at the bar of a smoke-filled tavern, drowning wages in whiskey or tossing them into card games where the stakes rose higher than his pay. His voice, once the pride of the church pews, was rarely heard except in drunken fragments of song between drinks. There was a night when Johnny leaned against the jukebox, coins already spent, staring at Elvis's face on the glowing cover of a record. A group of men at the bar muttered about the King's return from service, about the concert selling out before tickets reached the counter. Johnny laughed bitterly, though no one had asked for his opinion. "I knew him," he muttered. "We used to sing together. He wasn't the only one with a voice." The men ignored him. The words tasted sour even to himself. One humid evening in Memphis, fate pulled the two threads of their lives together again. Elvis, dressed casually to avoid attention, had slipped away from his entourage to buy a soda from a street corner machine. He liked small, ordinary moments like that. They grounded him. As he reached for the glass bottle, he noticed a figure leaning against the brick wall nearby. Johnny Ray. Older now, face harder, eyes tired, but unmistakable. For a second, Elvis froze, uncertain whether to speak. Then Johnny turned his head, and recognition sparked. "Elvis!" His tone carried neither warmth nor surprise, only a flat acknowledgement, as if naming something unavoidable. "Johnny," Elvis said softly, a smile forming despite the tension. "Been a long time." They stood in the glow of the streetlight, the hum of the soda machine filling the silence. Johnny's posture was guarded, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. Elvis, with fame etched into his every gesture, tried to bridge the years with kindness. "You still singing?" he asked. Johnny gave a short laugh, bitter and sharp. "Singing? I'm breaking my back carrying other men's loads. Bars, warehouses, anything that pays enough for the next hand of cards. No, I'm not singing." Elvis studied him, seeing not just the man in front of him, but the boy on the porch in Tupelo, the voice that had once filled a church with wonder. "You had something special, Johnny. Still do. Maybe you just need the right chance." At that, Johnny's eyes narrowed. "Chance? You think I never had the chance? You think it all came down to luck?" His voice cracked with anger. "I had a voice stronger than yours back then. Everyone said it. But I didn't have your mother. I didn't have anyone pulling me out when things got rough. Life doesn't hand out second chances." Elvis stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I could help you now, if you wanted. Not as charity, Johnny, as a friend. Come work with me. Travel, sing, whatever it takes to get you back where you belong." But Johnny shook his head, jaw tight. "No, I won't stand behind you holding your coat. I won't be your shadow, Elvis. Maybe you can't understand what that feels like, but I do. I'd rather scrape by in the dark than live in your light as nothing more than the boy who could have been." The words cut deeper than Johnny perhaps intended. Elvis didn't argue. He saw the pride burning in his old friend, the stubbornness that would rather drown than accept a lifeline. It was not arrogance, it was survival, twisted into defiance. The streetlight flickered, a train horn wailed in the distance, and the moment slipped away. Johnny pulled his jacket tighter and muttered something about having to go. Elvis watched him walk into the night, a silhouette swallowed by Memphis shadows. That evening lingered in Elvis's mind long after he returned to Graceland. He replayed the conversation again and again, wondering if there was something he could have said differently, some way he could have reached Johnny without wounding his pride. But the truth was, Johnny had already chosen his path. The boy with the golden voice was now a man tangled in bitterness, unwilling to accept help, afraid of being seen as lesser. And so, while Elvis's career soared, records sold by the millions, concerts packed with screaming fans, Johnny drifted further into the city's underbelly. Their lives, once parallel, now stretched in opposite directions, each step widening the distance between them. For Elvis, the encounter reopened an old ache. For Johnny, it deepened the wound of envy. Two boys who once sang under the same stars now stood on different stages, one beneath the blinding lights of fame, the other in the dim corners of bars where nobody listened. And though neither of them knew it, the brief exchange by the soda machine would not be their last crossing. By the mid-1960s, Memphis had a rhythm all its own. The city no longer carried only the echoes of gospel and blues. It pulsed with rock and roll, neon signs, and the smell of bourbon drifting from bars that never seemed to close. On Beale Street, horns blared, guitars cried, and men lost paychecks at poker tables before sunrise. For those with money, it was a carnival. For those without, it was a trap. Johnny Ray lived in that trap. He had long since traded the hopeful shine in his eyes for a haze of smoke and cheap liquor. The days blurred, loading docks by day, cards and whiskey by night. Every debt drove him deeper, and every promise to himself, "I'll stop tomorrow," fell apart the moment he heard the rattle of dice or the shuffle of cards. He had once sung at bars for a drink, his voice still strong enough to silence a room for a few minutes. But applause never paid the rent, and whiskey dulled what talent remained. Soon he wasn't the man with a voice anymore. He was the man who owed too much, who drank too fast, who borrowed money he couldn't repay. The turning point came on a rain-slick night near the riverfront. Johnny and two men he barely trusted planned what they called a quick job. It wasn't grand, just breaking into a warehouse, taking enough to square debts, maybe even leave town for a while. But crime rarely stops where men say it will. What began as a desperate theft turned into violence when a watchman surprised them. Shouts, fists, the glint of a knife. By the time it ended, the night was torn apart by sirens. Johnny ran, breath ragged, shoes slapping puddles, but the city's alleys offered no escape. Police pulled him down in the mud, hands cuffed behind his back, face pressed to cold pavement. The rain washed over him as though trying to clean away the years of mistakes, but nothing could change what had just happened. The newspapers didn't give him more than a few lines. Local man arrested in attempted robbery near riverfront. It was the kind of story people skimmed before moving on to bigger headlines. But one man did not move on. In Graceland, Elvis Presley unfolded the paper, eyes tracing the name that to most was just another stranger. Johnny Ray. He sat for a long time staring at those words. The boy who had once outshone him in church pews, the friend who had eaten at his table, the boy who had whispered dreams under Mississippi stars, now reduced to a criminal's name in small print. Elvis folded the paper carefully, as if rough hands might erase the memory. He slipped it into a drawer rather than throwing it away. Something in him couldn't let it go. The weeks that followed brought the trial. Courtrooms in Memphis had their own smell. Old wood polished too many times, sweat and paper mixing into something heavy. Reporters filled benches, hungry for gossip. Judges looked tired before the gavel even struck. On the day of Johnny's hearing, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs about the crime, about the city's crime rate, about nothing important to the man in chains. Elvis came quietly, dressed simply, hat low, trying not to draw eyes. Fame was a shadow he could not shake, but in that moment he wanted only to be a face in the crowd. He sat on a hard bench, hands folded, as deputies led prisoners through a side door. And then Johnny appeared. Shackles at his ankles, prison clothes rough against his skin. His shoulders were still broad. His face still sharp, but the defiance was gone. His eyes, once filled with restless fire, looked hollow. For Elvis, it was like being struck. He remembered nights when Johnny's laughter filled the air, when his voice rose so high it seemed to scrape the stars. Now that same boy walked chained, eyes cast down, every step echoing across the silent courtroom. The contrast was unbearable. When Johnny finally lifted his head, their eyes met. Recognition flared, and for a heartbeat time folded. They were back on the porch, barefoot, humming hymns into the night. But the present crashed in quickly. Prison clothes, guards, whispers of the crowd. Johnny looked away, shame cutting deeper than any chain. The prosecutor's voice rang out, cold and certain. Charges of theft, assault, resisting arrest. Each word painted Johnny not as a desperate man, but as a danger to society. The jury listened with stiff faces. The crowd murmured. Pens scratched across notepads. But Elvis heard none of it clearly. His mind was filled with the memory of a boy too hungry to sleep, too proud to beg, singing his heart out to drown the sound of his father's anger. As the charges were read, silence pressed heavy in the room. Everyone turned, waiting for reaction, from the jury, from the accused, from the crowd. And there, among them, sat Elvis Presley, the most recognizable man in America, watching a childhood friend stand accused in chains. The room seemed to hold its breath as though waiting for something to break the stillness. Elvis leaned forward, every muscle tight, words caught in his throat. He had no plan, no speech prepared, only the raw weight of memory and grief. And just as the air seemed ready to shatter, the gavel struck, calling a pause. The moment held, suspended, demanding what would come next. The courthouse on Union Avenue was older than most of the men who worked there. Its walls smelled of mildew and varnish, and the ceiling fans turned lazily, moving hot air instead of cooling it. On the morning of Johnny Ray's hearing, the benches were filled, some with ordinary townsfolk curious for a spectacle, others with reporters eager to find a headline, and a few with lawyers shifting papers nervously. The sound was a low murmur like bees in a hive, until the bailiff barked for order and the gavel struck. Johnny entered under guard, chains clinking faintly with each step. His prison clothes hung loose on his frame. The man who once carried himself with fierce pride now seemed reduced but not destroyed. He walked as if daring the world to look at him differently. And then he saw Elvis in the crowd. It lasted no more than a second, but in that second Johnny's face faltered. His jaw tightened, his stride hitched. The boy from Tupelo had returned, but not in memory. He was right there on the bench, his eyes fixed on him with something between grief and stubborn loyalty. Johnny swallowed hard, then forced himself to glance away, head turning sharply as though the sight burned. For Elvis, the reaction felt like a blow to the chest. That quick refusal to meet his gaze told him more than words ever could. Shame had settled deep inside Johnny, and pride was holding it in place. The prosecutor rose with papers in hand, his voice dry, professional, almost rehearsed. He laid out the story as if Johnny were a hardened criminal. Conspiracy to steal, assault on a guard, reckless disregard for the law. The words piled up like stones, each one meant to bury him deeper. The audience shifted uneasily, some nodding along, others whispering that justice must be done. But then came a witness, a night worker from the docks who had seen Johnny before the robbery. Nervous, wringing his hands, the man blurted something not in the script. It wasn't supposed to go that way. He didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. He was desperate. The courtroom stilled. Even the prosecutor paused, frowning at the slip. The statement cracked the neat portrait of Johnny as nothing more than a thug. It suggested something else, a cornered man making foolish choices, not a predator hunting victims. The tension in the room shifted. Some faces softened, others hardened, but everyone leaned forward. From his bench, Elvis felt his pulse quicken. The moment was small, but it carried weight. He could see it. Johnny wasn't gone, not entirely. Beneath the grime of bad choices, beneath the bitterness, there was still the boy who had once sung beside him. The boy who could silence a congregation with the power of his voice. Elvis gripped the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles whitened. If there was even a chance to show the court that Johnny's story wasn't as simple as the prosecutor claimed, it had to be taken. The judge, gray-haired and weary, shifted in his seat, sensing the air change. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. The prosecutor cleared his throat and pressed forward, eager to close the gap the witness had opened. Yet the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted. Elvis sat still, but inside he was anything but calm. Memories flooded him. Nights when Johnny appeared at his door bruised and hungry. Mornings when they'd raced barefoot to catch the sound of a guitar drifting from a neighbor's porch. Afternoons when Johnny's laughter drowned out the sound of cicadas. All of that lived inside the man now chained before the court. And Elvis knew if everyone else forgot, he could not. The murmurs in the courtroom returned louder this time, carrying questions instead of conclusions. Some spectators turned toward Elvis, realizing who he was, whispering his name like a secret too large to contain. A reporter leaned toward another and hissed, "Imagine the story. Presley sitting in on a trial for some low-life thief." Pens scratched faster. The presence of the king in the small courtroom was becoming its own drama, layered on top of Johnny's fate. But Elvis wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about loyalty, about the strange burden of being one of the few who knew Johnny's whole story. He didn't yet know what he would do, but he felt it building in his chest. Silence would not be enough. The prosecutor ended with sharp words, the kind that hung heavy in the air. "This man is not a victim. He is a danger. And the law demands protection from men like him." He sat, satisfied. The judge called for a recess. The gavel struck. People rose, stretching legs, whispering fiercely. Cameras flashed as journalists hurried out to telephone their papers. And through it all, Elvis remained seated, his eyes fixed on the spot where Johnny had stood. Johnny was led away again, chains rattling faintly, and for an instant he glanced over his shoulder. Their eyes did not meet, but Elvis saw the hesitation in his step, the stiffness in his jaw. Pride still ruled him, but beneath it lay fear. The courtroom emptied slowly like a church after service, yet the silence lingered, heavy and unresolved. Something was coming, something beyond the tidy arguments of lawyers, beyond the polished words of prosecutors. Elvis felt it in his bones. The story of Johnny Ray was not over, and neither was his own role in it. The courtroom had always been a place of rigid procedure where men in suits argued in measured tones and where lives were reduced to evidence and law. But that afternoon, as the recess ended and people shuffled back into their seats, something had shifted. The air felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the country, was sitting silently among the crowd. The gossip had already reached the streets outside, where clusters of people pressed against the courthouse steps, craning their necks for a glimpse of him. Inside, Johnny sat with his hands cuffed, staring at the table before him, shoulders slumped. The prosecutors whispered among themselves, already preparing to hammer the case back into their favor. The defense attorney looked worn, almost defeated, his papers scattered like fallen leaves. And then Elvis stood. The movement was quiet, but it rippled through the room instantly. A rustle of fabric, the squeak of the wooden bench, and then heads turned one by one until the entire courtroom seemed to tilt toward him. Journalists froze mid-sentence, pens poised in the air. Even the judge paused, peering over his spectacles in disbelief. Elvis adjusted his jacket, took a breath, and spoke to the defense lawyer. "Let me testify," he said, his voice calm but firm. The lawyer blinked at him, stunned, as if unsure he had heard correctly. The reporters, sensing a story beyond imagination, nearly leapt from their seats. Cameras clicked frantically, shutters snapping like popcorn. "You don't need to—" the attorney began in a whisper. But Elvis shook his head. "I do." His eyes didn't leave Johnny, who still refused to look up. When Elvis finally stepped forward, escorted to the witness stand, the entire courtroom was silent. Even the ceiling fans seemed to stop their lazy circling. The clerk asked him to swear the oath, and Elvis raised his hand, the same hand that had once strummed a battered guitar on a Tupelo porch. "I swear," he said simply. The prosecutor smirked, ready to dismantle what he assumed would be a spectacle. But when Elvis began to speak, his tone was not grand or theatrical. It was plain, unvarnished, and carried the weight of truth. "I've known Johnny Ray almost all my life," he began. "We grew up in the same dirt, on the same streets in Tupelo. We were boys with nothing in our pockets but music in our heads. He had a voice that made people stop what they were doing and listen. Stronger than mine, even. Folks used to say he was the one who'd go far." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Johnny's eyes flickered upward just for a second before dropping again. Elvis continued. He spoke of afternoons spent listening to gospel on a crackling radio, of nights sneaking off to watch traveling musicians from behind fences. He painted a picture of two boys chasing the same dream, hungry and barefoot, but alive with hope. His voice was steady, but his words carried the rhythm of memory, drawing everyone in as though they were hearing a song. And I remember, Elvis said, pausing for breath, how Johnny would come to my house hungry, how my mama would feed him when his own home was too hard to stay in, how he carried burdens no child should carry. The prosecutor shifted impatiently, rolling his pen between his fingers, but even he could not break the spell. The judge leaned back, listening more intently than before. Reporters wrote furiously, their notes turning into headlines before the words even finished. Elvis did not excuse the crime. He did not deny the facts. "I'm not here to say what he did was right," he said. "I'm here to tell you who he is. This isn't some hardened criminal who planned to hurt anyone. This is a man who life cornered until he made a mistake. He deserves more than to be thrown away. He deserves a chance." For a moment, no one breathed. It was as though the courtroom itself had become a stage, and Elvis had filled it with something larger than law, memory, humanity, the sound of friendship that had survived the years. The prosecutor finally rose, smiling thinly. "Mr. Presley, with all due respect, this is a court of law, not a concert hall. Your testimony may inspire, but it cannot erase the facts." Elvis met his gaze without flinching. "I know what the facts are, but I also know what's behind them, and sometimes that's the part that matters most." The words hung in the air. The judge shifted again, tapping his gavel lightly, not to silence, but almost as if to ground himself. In the benches, people whispered. Not about the crime, but about Elvis's loyalty, his courage to stand in defense of someone everyone else had written off. Johnny sat unmoving, but inside him the walls cracked. Hearing his old friend, the king himself, speak of him not as a failure, not as a thief, but as the boy he once was, stirred something buried deep. His pride fought it, but the weight of Elvis's words pressed harder. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, pressing against police barriers. News spread like wildfire. Elvis Presley speaks for a prisoner. Headlines were already being drafted in nearby newsrooms. But inside, there was only silence. Silence. And the lingering echo of Elvis's words. Words that cut through years of bitterness and shame. The session ended with no verdict yet, only stunned faces and hurried notes. But everyone in that room knew something had shifted. The trial was no longer about a nameless man and a crime on the riverfront. It was about loyalty, memory, and whether redemption was possible for a man nearly lost to the world. And as Elvis stepped down from the stand, the look he gave Johnny wasn't one of pity. It was a reminder, unspoken but clear. You are not forgotten. Morning light slanted through the courthouse windows, cutting pale lines across the wooden floor. The crowd was larger than the day before. Word had spread quickly. And now people who had never set foot in a courtroom came just to witness the trial where Elvis Presley had spoken. Outside, the press clustered shoulder to shoulder, their cameras pointed at the entrance, while inside, anticipation pulsed like a drumbeat. Elvis sat quietly in the gallery, his posture calm, though his mind churned with unease. The night before, newspapers had already printed the story. The king defends an accused man. Some called it noble, others reckless. His manager had phoned, furious, warning that such involvement could tarnish his image. But Elvis had listened in silence and then set the receiver down, unmoved. What mattered was not his career, not the glitter of stardom. It was the boy he once knew, now chained before the world. The judge struck the gavel, calling for the next witness. From the back of the room came the sound of a cane tapping against the floor. Heads turned as an older woman made her way forward, small but upright, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes sharp despite the years. The clerk announced her name, and a ripple of recognition moved through the gallery. She had been a schoolteacher in Tupelo decades earlier. For Elvis, the sight of her stirred memories of chalk dust, wooden desks, and hymns sung at school assemblies. She took the stand with dignity. When asked what she knew of Johnny Ray, she folded her hands and began slowly. "I taught him when he was a boy," she said, her voice steady. "I remember his voice, how the other children would stop to listen. He had a gift, no doubt. But I also remember the bruises he tried to hide under his sleeves, the way he would fall asleep at his desk because he hadn't eaten. That boy did not have the life every child deserves. He carried more sorrow than most grown men." Her words settled over the room like a soft veil, shifting the atmosphere again. The prosecutor attempted to steer her testimony back to the present crime, but her answers were unshakable. "You ask me if he was always troubled," she said firmly. "I tell you he was troubled because life gave him no peace, but he was kind. He was generous. He sang like an angel when his world was closer to hell." Elvis closed his eyes briefly, the truth of it striking deep. Johnny sat motionless, but his jaw tightened, and his cuffed hands gripped the edge of the table. Hearing his past laid bare was both unbearable and relieving, as if someone had finally spoken aloud what he had carried in silence for years. Then came the most unexpected turn. During cross-examination, the defense attorney pressed details about the night of the robbery. Witnesses contradicted each other. One statement slipped. Johnny had not held the knife. Another revealed that one of his companions had fled untouched, leaving Johnny to face the brunt of blame. Slowly, a different picture emerged, one where Johnny had shielded another man, taking responsibility to keep someone else from harsher punishment. The room tensed as this truth unraveled. Gasps escaped from the benches. Reporters scribbled frantically. Even the judge leaned forward, brow furrowed, as if weighing the new light against the heavy charges. Elvis felt his fists clench, nails pressing into his palms. This was what he had sensed all along, that Johnny was not lost to cruelty, but trapped by choices, by loyalty to the wrong people, by circumstances that twisted his path. It didn't absolve him, but it revealed a complexity the prosecutor's story had ignored. Johnny, for the first time since the trial began, lifted his head fully. His eyes darted across the room, not to Elvis, not to the jury, but upward, almost as if searching for air. He looked like a man suddenly visible after years in the shadows. The prosecutor tried to regain ground, hammering on the fact that the law did not excuse participation in crime. His words were sharp, practiced, but the weight in the room had shifted. The jurors listened differently now, their expressions less certain, their pens moving slower. For Elvis, the moment was nearly unbearable. He wanted to stand, to shout that Johnny was not just a case file, not just a man in chains, but the same boy who had once sung harmony with him in the night air. Instead, he remained seated, shoulders taut, watching as the proceedings edged toward something fragile. Hope. The gavel struck again, calling order. The judge announced that further testimony would continue the next day. Murmurs rose as people filed out, their voices tinged with amazement at what they had witnessed. Outside, reporters rushed to telephones, sending new headlines into print. Presley's childhood friend may have been scapegoat. Inside, Elvis lingered. Johnny was being led away when their eyes finally met again. For the first time in years, Johnny did not look away. His stare was unguarded, raw, filled with confusion, shame, and something else. Something that looked like gratitude he could not yet admit. The chains rattled, the doors closed, and the silence returned. Elvis sat alone on the bench for a moment longer, his thoughts heavy. He knew the trial was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, against public opinion, against the law's cold machinery, even against Johnny's own pride. But for the first time since this began, he felt the tide shifting. The crossroads lay ahead. Whether Johnny would rise or fall again, Elvis could not know. But he had chosen his path already, He would not abandon him. Not now, not ever. By dawn, the courthouse steps were no longer just stone. They had become a stage. Crowds gathered long before the trial resumed, some clutching hand-painted signs with Elvis's name scrawled across them, others waving papers that branded him reckless for standing beside an accused criminal. The voices rose in two competing choirs, one singing his praises for loyalty, the other warning that he was tarnishing his crown. The press fed the fire. Headlines sprawled across the country. Elvis defends prisoner in courtroom drama. The king risks reputation for boyhood friend. On radios, commentators debated whether this was heroism or folly. And in the smoky back rooms of music offices, managers and promoters fretted. Contracts, endorsements, appearances, everything could be shaken if the king aligned himself with scandal. Inside Graceland, phones rang without pause. Colonel Parker's voice thundered down the line. "You don't know what you're doing, boy. This ain't a church service. It's a court of law. You'll ruin yourself." Elvis listened, silent, eyes fixed on the window where dawn light cut across the curtains. When Parker finally paused for breath, Elvis answered quietly, "Colonel, I can't sit back and watch a man drown when I know how to swim." Then he hung up. By the time Elvis stepped once again into the courthouse, the air outside was electric. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks, and reporters shouted questions he did not answer. Fans pressed forward, some crying, some jeering, as if the building had turned into a theater where the king himself was performing a new kind of show. But Elvis's expression did not change. His eyes stayed on the doors ahead, his pace steady. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever, spectators squeezed shoulder to shoulder. The judge looked weary, aware that the trial had grown larger than the crime itself. This was no longer simply the case of Johnny Ray. It was now about the reach of fame, about morality, about whether loyalty could outweigh reputation. The prosecution pressed hard that day, their words sharp and unyielding. They painted Johnny again as a danger, insisting that no story of childhood hardship could erase the knife at the scene. They warned that sympathy was not justice, yet each sentence felt strained, as if pushing against the new current that had entered the room since Elvis's testimony. In the gallery, Elvis sat with his hands clasped, listening to every word. He felt the tension coil inside him, but he did not flinch. To abandon Johnny now would mean abandoning the truth he had already spoken aloud. The defense countered with quiet persistence, bringing forward small details that chipped away at the prosecution's certainty. Witnesses faltered, memories blurred, and the story of Johnny as a heartless criminal grew less convincing with each hour. Still, outside the courtroom, the storm raged louder. Fans who adored Elvis for his songs now argued about his character. Some carried banners with his face beneath the word loyalty. Others held signs declaring the king stands with criminals. Television crews filmed the shouting, the pushing, the police trying to hold the lines. That evening, back at Graceland, Elvis sat with a few close friends in the den. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, untouched coffee cooling on the table. One of his inner circle leaned forward and spoke what others were thinking. This could end badly. They're saying you're siding with crime. You've got concerts lined up, movies. People might turn on you." Elvis looked at them, eyes tired but steady. "If I lose a stage, I lose the stage. But if I lose myself, I lose everything. Johnny's not just some man on trial. He's the boy I grew up with. He's the one who sang louder than I ever could. If I walk away now, what good's the name I've made?" His words settled over the room, leaving no reply. Those who knew him best recognized the tone. It was not defiance, but conviction. The next morning, the papers sharpened their knives further. King gambles his throne. Commentators spoke of risk, of foolish loyalty, of the fragility of celebrity. But others wrote differently, praising his courage, calling it a rare glimpse of humanity behind the icon. The country was split, but no one looked away. When court resumed, Johnny was led in again, the chains clinking softly. He looked thinner, but his eyes carried a flicker that had not been there before. He had heard the noise outside, the chants, the cries, the fact that Elvis Presley had tied his fate to his. Pride and shame battled within him, but for the first time he seemed to stand taller, as if remembering he had once been more than his mistakes. And so the trial continued, suspended between two forces, the cold machinery of law and the raw pull of loyalty and memory. Elvis sat in the middle of it all, the weight of reputation pressing on one side, the weight of conscience on the other. He had chosen already. Fame could be rebuilt. Integrity, once lost, could not. By the time the final day of testimony arrived, the courthouse had ceased to be a mere building. It was now an arena where reputation, memory, and justice collided under the eyes of the entire nation. The line outside stretched down the block. Fans, skeptics, journalists, even a handful of musicians and actors curious enough to witness history unfold. Police kept the crowds at bay, though the chants and camera flashes carried through the thick wooden doors. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. The judge sat rigid, his face unreadable, while jurors exchanged brief, tight glances. The prosecutor stacked his papers like weapons. The defense attorney, though weary, seemed steadier now, emboldened by the tide that had shifted over the past days. And at the defense table sat Johnny Ray, thinner than when the trial began, but his posture less defeated. The weight of Elvis's loyalty had begun to press against the bars of his shame. As proceedings opened, Johnny surprised everyone. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something, then rose slowly to his feet. Shackles clinked against the wooden floor as he addressed the court. His voice was rough. Not the voice that once drew gasps in churches, but it carried a rawness that silenced the room. "I know what I've done," Johnny said. "I'm guilty of making choices that led me here. I drank too much, gambled too much, wasted the gift I was given. I thought I could outrun myself, but I was wrong. And if it hadn't been for him—" He paused, eyes flicking toward Elvis for only a heartbeat. "If it hadn't been for him, I'd probably be dead by now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, sensing the impact. Johnny's words were not excuses, they were confessions stripped bare. "I can't change the past," he continued, "but I can tell you this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I wasn't looking to be some thief people whisper about in papers. I was just lost. If there's a chance to stand again, I'll take it. If not, then this is where my road ends." For a moment, the courtroom was utterly still. No coughs, no whispers, just the sound of the ceiling fan clicking as it turned. Even the judge seemed caught off guard. Then, from the benches, Elvis rose. He did not stride with theatrics, did not command attention with grandeur. He simply stood, his voice low, almost conversational yet powerful enough to pierce the silence. "I've listened to every word here," he said. "I've heard about the law, about guilt, about danger. But when I look at that man, I don't see what the papers print. I don't see what the prosecutor says. I see the boy who sang hymns beside me in a little church when neither of us had shoes on our feet. I see the friend who sat on my porch with an empty stomach and still managed to laugh. I see a man who was broken by what he came from, not by who he is inside." His voice dipped even softer. "If this world is ready to throw him away, then let the world know this. I won't. I'll stand beside him, no matter what anyone writes, no matter what it costs me." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. Reporters froze, pens slack in their hands. One dropped his pencil, the clatter echoing like thunder. A woman in the back wiped tears from her cheeks. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, lifted his head as though startled by something he had never seen before. The prosecutor opened his mouth as if to object, but found no words. The defense attorney bowed his head, knowing nothing he could say would carry greater force than what had just been spoken. The judge himself sat motionless, gavel in hand, but unwilling to interrupt the silence that followed. It was not the roar of a concert. It was not the scream of adoring fans. It was something deeper, the quiet recognition that for once fame was not being used for glory but for loyalty. Johnny sat frozen, eyes locked on Elvis. Pride warred with gratitude in his expression, but the wall inside him had cracked fully now. The bitterness that had kept him from lifting his head in shame began to dissolve. For the first time since the trial began, his gaze did not falter. The courtroom exhaled at last, a collective breath no one had realized they were holding. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "The court will recess until verdict," he announced, though his voice carried less authority than usual, as if even he had been humbled. As the gavel fell, the room erupted. Reporters rushing for telephones, spectators whispering furiously, guards escorting Johnny back toward the holding room. But in the midst of chaos, there remained a strange hush where Elvis had stood, as though his words lingered in the air, unwilling to leave. Outside, the crowd roared louder than before, flashbulbs bursting like a storm. Inside, people would remember not the speeches of lawyers, not the arguments of law, but the quiet conviction of a man who chose friendship over image. And somewhere deep inside Johnny Ray, the echo of hymns sung long ago stirred again, faint but alive. The last morning of the trial arrived with skies heavy and gray, as if the weather itself mirrored the weight of what was about to unfold. By sunrise, the courthouse lawn was already overrun with crowds. The noise outside was thunderous. Chants, shouted prayers, the cries of fans, the jeers of critics. Police struggled to hold back the swelling mass of people pressed against the barricades. Reporters shouted into microphones, their voices carried over radios across the country. Today, the fate of Johnny Ray will be decided, with Elvis Presley seated only feet away from the accused. Inside, the courtroom hummed with restrained energy. Jurors filed in, faces tight and unreadable. The judge sat taller than usual, his robe draped like armor, but his eyes betrayed fatigue from days of relentless testimony and headlines. Johnny Ray sat at the defense table, shackles at his ankles, shoulders rigid. His hands clenched and unclenched, the iron biting his wrists. Beside him, the defense lawyer shuffled papers he no longer needed. Words had already been spoken. Now the silence belonged to 12 strangers. Elvis was there again, seated quietly in the gallery. He wore no glittering suit, no stage adornments, only a dark jacket, his hair neatly combed back. His presence was impossible to ignore, but he carried himself without flourish, as though he wanted only to witness, not to dominate. Yet even still, reporters leaned forward, their eyes fixed on him as much as on the man about to hear his fate. The gavel struck. The clerk read the jury's decision, each syllable slicing through the air. Not guilty on the charge of assault. Guilty on attempted theft. But instead of a long prison sentence, the judge, after a pause that seemed eternal, pronounced a conditional sentence. Probation, supervised rehabilitation, and mandatory labor in a community program. No cell walls. No years erased, a second chance. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, applause from some, anger from others. One man cried out, "This is a disgrace," while another woman whispered fiercely, "Mercy, thank God." The sound was chaos, raw and unstoppable. Through it all, Johnny sat stunned, his jaw slack, as though the words had not yet reached him fully. The judge banged his gavel for silence, his voice rising above the storm. "Order! Order in this court!" But the tide was too strong. He finally gave up, closing his book and retreating to chambers as the bailiff struggled to clear the aisle. Amid the noise, Elvis remained still. When the guards pulled Johnny to his feet, preparing to lead him out through the side door, Elvis rose. For a moment, the noise dimmed, curiosity silencing even the reporters. Elvis stepped toward the rail, his hand reaching across the barrier of polished wood. Johnny, almost mechanically, lifted his cuffed wrists, and for the first time in decades, their hands met. It was not dramatic, not rehearsed. No words passed between them, but the clasp of their hands carried a history no one else in that room could understand. Barefoot races on dusty Tupelo roads, whispered dreams under starlight, the taste of shared sandwiches, the echo of hymns sung in a wooden church. Two boys weathered into men, bound again in silence. Flashbulbs burst, white light searing across their faces. Journalists shouted, desperate for a quote, for a phrase that would sum up the impossible. But Elvis did not speak. He gave only a small nod, holding Johnny's gaze until the guards pulled him gently away. Outside, the crowd roared. The verdict raced across radio wires and newsrooms. Presley's friend spared prison. The king chooses loyalty over fame. The headlines multiplied by the minute, each twisting the story into legend. But Elvis did not exit through the front, where the spectacle awaited. Instead, he slipped through a side corridor, a quiet door reserved for staff and officials. And waiting there, unexpectedly, was Johnny, escorted by a deputy who looked the other way as though granting a small mercy. They walked together down the dim hallway, the sound of their footsteps the only rhythm. Elvis didn't speak immediately. Words felt too thin for the moment. Finally, he said softly, "It isn't over, Johnny. You've got to fight now. No more running." Johnny swallowed, his throat tight. For once his eyes did not harden with pride. Instead, they glistened. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "You can," Elvis replied. "You've got a chance. That's more than most men get. Don't waste it." The deputy cleared his throat, signaling time was short. Elvis touched Johnny's shoulder once, firm, steady, then turned and walked away. There were no cameras in that hallway, no fans screaming his name. Just two men parting in silence, carrying the weight of what had passed. Later, as Elvis left the courthouse through the black exit door, the crowd surged, blinded by cameras, deafened by their own shouts. He did not wave, did not smile. He stepped into the waiting car, the door closing with a hollow thud, leaving the noise behind. For days, the newspapers would argue about what had happened. Some called him foolish, others noble. Some said he had risked his crown, others claimed he had polished it brighter. But Elvis himself gave no interviews, offered no clarifications. He returned to Graceland, to the quiet of his home, carrying with him not triumph or scandal, but a simple truth. He had chosen his friend when it mattered most. In the years that followed, the story of Johnny Ray faded from headlines, swallowed by new scandals, new songs, new wars, new heroes. But in the memory of those who sat in that courtroom, who heard the king speak not as an idol, but as a man, the silence after his final words remained unforgettable. It was not a fairy tale, not a redemption wrapped neatly with ribbons. It was something harsher, truer, a glimpse of loyalty stronger than image, of conscience louder than fame. And for those who knew both boys in Tupelo, who remembered their voices rising in harmony under the Mississippi stars, it was the echo of a promise kept at last.